In June 1967, a war lasting less than a week redrew the political map of the Middle East. Israel fought a coalition of Arab states, primarily Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, in a conflict that became known as the Six-Day War. By the time the ceasefires were in place, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank including East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. These territorial changes did not simply mark a military victory. They created disputes over occupation, borders, refugees, security, and national identity that continue to shape the region decades later. To understand why 6 days mattered so much, we have to begin years earlier, with unresolved tensions from the First Arab-Israeli War and the fragile armistice lines that followed it. After the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israel and neighboring Arab states signed armistice agreements in 1949. These agreements stopped the fighting, but they did not create a final peace. The borders were armistice lines, not universally accepted permanent frontiers. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip, Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Syria held positions overlooking parts of northern Israel. Relations remained hostile, and both sides viewed the other through the lens of threat and survival. For Israel, surrounded by states that rejected its legitimacy, security planning focused on speed, intelligence, and preemption. For Arab governments, the unresolved Palestinian question and the outcome of 1948 remained sources of anger, political pressure, and military ambition. The region was not at peace, it was in a tense pause between wars. One flashpoint was the Straits of Tiran, a narrow maritime passage giving access to the Israeli port of Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba. In 1956, Egypt's closure of maritime passageways to Israeli shipping contributed to the Suez Crisis, when Israel invaded Egypt alongside a broader crisis involving Britain and France. The result was not a lasting settlement, but it did reopen the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. A United Nations emergency force, known as UNEF, was placed along the Egypt-Israel border to help separate the sides. After 1956, Israel made its position clear: if Egypt closed the straits again, Israel would treat that as a cause for war. This point mattered deeply in 1967, because it turned a diplomatic and maritime dispute into a potential trigger for a major military confrontation. By the spring of 1967, the atmosphere had become dangerously unstable. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, was one of the most influential leaders in the Arab world. He presented himself as a champion of Arab nationalism and resistance to Israel, but he also faced pressure to prove that leadership. In May, Nasser moved Egyptian forces into defensive lines near the border with Israel and ordered UNEF personnel to withdraw. Then he announced that the Straits of Tiran would again be closed to Israeli vessels. From Israel's perspective, this seemed to confirm the exact scenario it had warned against since 1956. From Egypt's perspective, the moves were framed as defensive and political, but they created a crisis in which mobilized armies, public rhetoric, and mutual suspicion left very little room for retreat. The days before the war were filled with uncertainty. Israel debated whether to wait, seek more diplomacy, or strike first. Waiting carried risks. A small country with a narrow waist, Israel feared that a coordinated attack by neighboring armies could be devastating. Striking first also carried risks, because it could make Israel appear responsible for starting the war. Meanwhile, Jordan had entered into a defense pact with Egypt shortly before the fighting began, meaning that a war with Egypt could quickly expand eastward. Syria, already hostile to Israel and involved in earlier border tensions, remained a northern threat. The crisis had become regional. Once armies were mobilized and alliances activated, a single decision could bring multiple fronts into the conflict almost immediately. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched Operation Focus, a surprise air campaign aimed mainly at Egyptian airfields and aircraft. The strategy was bold and extremely risky. Israeli pilots flew low to avoid radar detection and struck early in the day, when many Egyptian aircraft were still on the ground. The result was decisive. Egypt's air force was devastated, with much of it destroyed before it could effectively respond. This gave Israel air supremacy, a critical advantage in modern warfare. Control of the skies meant Israeli ground forces could move with far less danger from enemy aircraft, while Egyptian units would struggle under attack from above. Operation Focus did not win the war by itself, but it shaped almost everything that followed. At the same time, Israeli ground forces advanced into the Sinai Peninsula and the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip. The Sinai was vast, harsh terrain, where speed and coordination mattered as much as numbers. Egyptian forces initially resisted, but the collapse of air cover and confusion in command made sustained defense increasingly difficult. As Israeli units pushed deeper, Nasser ordered an evacuation of the Sinai. That order contributed to disorder among retreating Egyptian forces, turning withdrawal into a chaotic collapse in many areas. By the fourth day of the war, Israel had occupied the entire Sinai Peninsula. This was a massive territorial gain, stretching Israel's military reach all the way to the Suez Canal. It also represented a severe defeat for Egypt and a personal humiliation for Nasser. Jordan's role was shaped by its new defense pact with Egypt and by the pressure of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Jordan did not launch the kind of full-scale offensive that could have overwhelmed Israel from the east, but it did attack Israeli positions, including in and around Jerusalem. Israel responded with force. The fighting in Jerusalem was especially significant because the city held enormous religious, national, and symbolic importance for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem and the wider West Bank from Jordan. This changed the status of one of the world's most contested cities and brought large Palestinian populations under Israeli control. The military victory was swift, but the political consequences were profound and unresolved. The northern front involved Syria and the Golan Heights, a plateau overlooking parts of northern Israel. Before and during the war, Syrian positions had strategic importance because artillery from higher ground could threaten communities below. On the fifth day, Syria intensified its involvement by shelling Israeli positions in the north. Israel then moved against Syrian forces on the Golan Heights. The terrain made the assault difficult, but by the end of the fighting Israel had captured the heights. Like the Sinai, the Golan was valuable not only as territory, but as strategic depth. Holding it changed the military balance along the Israeli-Syrian frontier. It also led to the flight or expulsion of many Syrians from the area, adding another layer to the war's human consequences. Ceasefires came quickly, but not all at once. Egypt and Jordan agreed to ceasefires on June 8, Syria on June 9, and the final arrangements with Israel were signed by June 11. The war had lasted only 6 days, yet the casualty numbers were heavy. More than 15,000 Arab soldiers and personnel were killed, while Israel suffered fewer than 1,000 deaths. Civilians and non-combatants were also caught in the violence. 20 Israeli civilians were killed in Arab airstrikes on Jerusalem. 15 United Nations peacekeepers were killed by Israeli strikes in the Sinai at the beginning of the war. In the USS Liberty incident, Israeli air and naval forces mistakenly attacked an American intelligence ship, killing 34 U.S. personnel. The speed of the war should not obscure its cost. The territorial outcome was extraordinary. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. These areas were not empty spaces on a map. They contained cities, villages, holy sites, military positions, farmland, roads, and hundreds of thousands of people. For Israelis, the victory brought a sense of security and strategic depth after years of vulnerability. For Arabs, it was a devastating defeat known by many as a catastrophe of leadership and arms. For Palestinians, the war meant that the West Bank and Gaza came under Israeli occupation, intensifying questions of self-determination, displacement, and political future. The post-war map created new bargaining chips, but also new sources of conflict. The human displacement after the war had long-term effects. Around 280,000 to 325,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from the West Bank, while about 100,000 Syrians fled or were expelled from the Golan Heights. These movements deepened refugee crises that were already central to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Families lost homes, communities were fragmented, and political identities hardened around memory, grievance, and return. In Egypt, Nasser resigned in shame after the defeat, but mass protests led to his reinstatement. The shock also changed regional politics. Egypt closed the Suez Canal from 1967 to 1975, affecting global trade and symbolizing the unfinished nature of the conflict. The Six-Day War ended quickly on the battlefield, but its consequences did not end with the ceasefire. The Six-Day War is remembered not simply because it was short, but because it compressed causes and consequences into an astonishingly brief period. It began in a climate of mobilization, fear, alliance commitments, and competing claims of security. It was shaped by Israel's decision to strike first and by the destruction of Egypt's air force in Operation Focus. It expanded across multiple fronts, drawing in Jordan and Syria. And it ended with Israel in control of territories that would become central to later negotiations, wars, uprisings, peace treaties, and international debate. 6 days changed borders, governments, military doctrines, and the lives of millions. To understand the modern Middle East, the events of June 1967 are not background history. They are part of the foundation. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.